You're watching World Insight. Still to come on our program. As a WHO tally of coronavirus infections exceeds already 3 million, the milestone begs the question, how can nations band together to turn tide of the pandemic? Some answers from a cultural scholar who is familiar with both the East and the West. Right after this. Welcome back. You're watching World Insight. I'm Tian Wei. The fight against coronavirus pandemic has claimed over 200,000 lives, but the battle has not been limited to hospitals, with accusations and squabbles flaring up between nations. How can they better work together? We try to figure out the answer about that with Daniel Bell, the Dean of the School of Political Science and Public Administration at Shandong University. He also is the co-author of the book Just Hierarchy: Why Social Hierarchies Matter in China and the Rest of the World. Let's listen in to what he had to say. He's believed to be familiar both with the East and the West. For more, I'm joined by Daniel Bell, who is the Dean of the School of Political Science and Public Administration at Shandong University. He's joining me now from Shanghai. Daniel, good to see you.
Thanks for having me.
Things are a little bit out of order, shall we say, as a result of the pandemic. And so is some of the debate we've been hearing. What do you make of the debate concerning, quote-unquote, the origin of the virus?
Well, I mean, I think it's too early to tell. We have to let the scientists determine the origin. But obviously the whole debate is so politicized at the moment. And in a way, it doesn't really matter what the origin is. The question is, how do we deal with it now, and how do we mitigate relapses in the future? I think that's more important now from a public policy perspective.
Yeah, it is so politicized that many feel the same way. Why is it, do you think?
Well, I mean, it is one of the kind of black swans that really throws our ordinary way of life out of whack in a way that hasn't happened perhaps since wartime. So obviously it's bound to be a political issue. But in contexts like the United States, where there's presidential elections in a few months, it's obviously even more likely to be used and misused by political leaders who want to gain votes rather than solve problems.
And as a result of that, for scholars like you, how do you see the latest debates?
Well, so in the very beginning, obviously, there were some mistakes made on this side in this country. But then once I think the central authorities decided to enact a plan starting about January 23rd to deal with this disease in a very, well, on the face of it, it seemed very draconian, but now it seems like from a health policy perspective, it seems like a prudent thing to do. Then since then, I think that in China, more or less, the political system has done quite a good job at dealing with it. I mean, certainly if I compare to where I'm from, in Montreal, Canada, where there was plenty of notice. I mean, here in China, we criticize leaders for taking maybe 3 or 4 weeks to get on board, but in Canada, they had a lot of time to prepare. They could, and yet they didn't. So it's not just something that's distinctive to the Chinese political system, unfortunately.
Should China care about these kinds of accusations?
I mean, if there's blatantly false information, I mean, at the moment, the most urgent need is to have global cooperation to deal with this pandemic. And if there's demonization of the Chinese political system or of Chinese people, that reduces the possibility of that cooperation, then it's something to worry about. So in my case, I was a bit surprised when I saw that a scholar that I respected a lot wrote something blatantly false that portrayed the Chinese government in a kind of immoral light, as though it wanted to deliberately spread the disease abroad. So I wrote something criticizing that scholar.
With so much misinformation flying around, how can we expect there will be real communication as, inside China possibly and outside? Most of people are reading very different sources of information, and some of these informations are totally different from one another, even though about the same thing.
Well, ultimately, we have to trust the experts. And so again, I wrote a book called Just Hierarchy, and we argue that any modern society needs hierarchies, and we know the ones that are unjust if they're based on race or sex or class. But if they're hierarchies based on knowledge and information or virtue, then we ought to respect those hierarchies. And in the case of information, for example, about epidemics or pandemics, obviously the scientists who carry out rigorous studies are the ones whose views should be respected. So that's one start, by trusting the sources that are published through a rigorous review process. At least we can begin by that. I mean, when it comes to academics and professional journalists, we expect standards of truth that are maybe higher than for ordinary people who say random stuff on the internet. So if they say something that's blatantly false, they need to be exposed. And as for political leaders, I mean, I think they have a duty, when there's not evidence to support what they say, at least to be cautious and not to spread misinformation.
All economies and all countries, all governments have to struggle with a balance of choices. One is social distancing, even lockdown of cities, and people being quarantined. Well, on the other hand, there's always the rights to job, the rights to movement, the rights to enjoy life, right? So what is the best way for this balance? And who is right and who is wrong? When is the right time? When is the wrong time? How to do this balance? Does the ancient philosophy from China teach us anything?
Well, Confucianism does prioritize values, and Confucianism is famous for its emphasis on moral education, but whether it's Confucius or Mencius or Xunzi or most of the other great Confucians, they all strongly emphasize that until you have a basic sense of material well-being, or to use modern language, until you kind of overcome poverty, it's very hard to spread morality. So there's a first priority, is to deal with poverty, provide for people's basic material well-being. I think that's another reason why the socialist tradition became so influential in China, because it tapped into this older tradition. And then we can talk about the other stuff. So at least that's one thing that I think Confucianism, and I think the socialist tradition also has right. I mean, but in the case of the pandemic, I mean, it is a political decision how we weigh these different values. That there's no right answer here. I mean, it really depends on how different cultures prioritize different values.
Yeah.
And because of the importance of reverence for elderly people here, that's how things are going to be done here, and it might not be true in other countries.
My conversation with Daniel Bell. Recently, people have been hearing about the National Republican Senatorial Committee in the U.S. has sent campaigns a detailed 57-page memo authored by a top Republican strategist advising GOP candidates to deflect the coronavirus crisis by aggressively attacking China, a blame game to gain political mileage. So on this, Daniel Bell gives his take.
Political leaders typically, they might say false things, but they also say things that are kind of true or kind of untrue and that are not supported by evidence, or else highly misleading. So that too should be exposed. But as you know, I mean, the United States is a very special place around election time, and unfortunately, the way to get support often is by demonizing your opponent, or sometimes by exaggerating the flaws and downplaying the virtues of your opponent. And in this case, obviously, the U.S. administration made huge mistakes in delaying ways of dealing with this pandemic, and rather than attributing flaws to themselves, they're going to look for the enemy. And unfortunately, China is the likely kind of punching bag. It happens often in U.S. elections, but it's been getting worse and worse, and even more worrisome. Even after the election, this demonization continues. I mean, that's really the most worrisome part.
Having said that, though, Daniel, in face to this, what can China do, or what can people like us who live in China and think the other side didn't get the sufficient information or even misinformation only do?
We do have to be humble and meanwhile help countries that are suffering through diverse means, which China is doing already, sending masks and medical aid and so on, and not playing those political games that are being played. I mean, in democracy, there's a very strong reason to play that around election time, but China, you know, for good I mean, the political system has advantages and disadvantages, but one of the advantages, it doesn't have to play, you know, those dirty games in public. So China should aim high. I mean, be humble and try and help other countries that are suffering, and meanwhile try and aim for global cooperation to deal with this global problem. So I think it's possible with other countries, and hopefully in the U.S. will become more rational at some point.
Daniel, you know, China has been accused of so many things. I mean, first of all, where the origin of the virus, of course, as we all heard from scientists, the origin of the virus is from the Earth, and therefore the human being as a whole have to deal with it. It's not that anyone invented it. So, secondly, when China tried to go out and try to support other countries by supporting with masks and also huge manufacturing capacity, others say, oh, you're doing mask diplomacy. You're trying to buy your way or masks your way into others' favorable policy towards China. And then there's also the accusation, one sort after another. So it seems that no matter what you do, there would always be negative accusations against you. Some are very groundless. So I just feel confused about this current situation. Do you?
Well, I mean, I think more or less there is strong support and gratitude for China when it sends masks and medical help and expertise, and without blatantly seeking anything in return. Again, if it's done in a humble way, there's much less likely to be backlash. And so I'm not so pessimistic. I mean, I do think that in the long term, providing aid to those who are suffering, if it's done in a humble way, is likely to lead to better relations. And not play not join those demagogues who are playing those dirty games. I mean, luckily in China there was a bit of that, but now it's been clamped down. And so I think it's a matter of time. I mean, the most worrisome part now is just in the U.S., where they're in a terrible situation and they're looking for enemies, and it's election time. And if we can get by this period without a disaster, and the next leader is more, let's say, more rational and less likely to appeal to people's worst emotions, then I think that relation could be improved too.
How should a country interact with the rest of the world when the West still have this attitude, apparently, of superiority, of ours is always better than yours? Even if you do well this time, it's only a slight chance that you can do well. Ours, however, on the other hand, could always do better. So how would you deal with something like that?
I think it's maybe more of a problem in the United States, where there's this widespread view that our way is the right way and it ought to be universally spread. I mean, there's more humility in smaller countries like Canada, for example, or in countries like Denmark. And So I think it's more of a problem with this. I mean, on the one hand, I think we need to recognize that there are some universal values, like, for example, the right to life, that the way that governments are evaluated in dealing with COVID-19 is whether they've done well at respecting the right to life. And on this standard, obviously China has done well relative to countries like the United States, according to this value of the right to life, which is so important and a universal. But in other ways, like what is the right way of selecting political leaders, or which sorts of cultural systems should be prioritized, or what's the right form of family life? I mean, we need to allow for diversity. And I mean, I think it's obvious for Chinese intellectuals that what's the right way of selecting leaders, for example, depends on a country's culture and national conditions, size, history, and so on. Whereas I think it still is a very strange view in most Western countries, most strongly held in the United States, that if you don't have our political system, you're fundamentally illegitimate. I mean, it's such a weird view, and we need to fight against that, not so much by criticizing their system, but by just saying that it's appropriate for you guys, given your history and your culture, but please allow for a bit of diversity, and please be tolerant regarding what we're doing here.